never declares what year the city of Troy was first besieged, but a listener would understand that his gods were alive, driving the chariots of their favorite heroes, forging their armor, stealing their wind, rescuing them from the battlefield. By the time Alexander was becoming the Great in 334 BC, he claimed just a sliver of divinity from his great-great-grandfather Hercules and his mother's grandfather Achilles. The gods were still given sacrifices for good fortune, sure, but a convenient storm just before monsoon season is a far cry from being literally dunked in the mythical river Styx by your sea nymph mother. That's the fun of folklore. The details get a little muddled, the truth gets stretched in the telling, but there's so much we can understand about the people who shared them. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next pile of videos, dissecting some of our unique American folktales to discover what they can teach us about the peoples, science, history, and ideas which spawned them. If that sounds like your jam, you know the drill. Hit subscribe, boop the bell, all that YouTube-y stuff. This is Myth America. When it comes to folk heroes, Johnny Appleseed is an odd one. A devout, plant-loving pacifist in a country which more often idolizes the individualist domination over one's environment. An itinerant mooch, barn surfing his way through the frontier in an era when proper pioneers were supposed to settle. A horrendous businessman who mostly kept his records in his head, and whose heir lost most of his scattered acreage in back taxes he owed on it. But Americans love a tall tale. And the real man, John Chapman, a well-known, harmless eccentric who liked to gather a crowd wherever he wandered but wrote none of it down, makes for an excellent template. To expansionists, he was practically the patron saint of manifest destiny, preceding the westward trudge of settlers with an ever-present source of food and forging peace with the native peoples whose lands they were invading, to the point of being fictionally eulogized by actually real fellow land stealer Sam Houston. For readers in 1871, exhausted by the bloodshed of the Civil War, his story was retold to emphasize harmonious frontier communities taking care of one another, how his pacifism included every living being, but he wasn't a coward, so he'd run dozens of miles between settlements to warn them of impending doom during the War of 1812. When Disney wanted to fight those godless commies, or Bible camp leaders want to distract 7-year-olds, John's quirky religious fervor gets whitewashed too.
The Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun and rain and an apple seed. Yes, He's been good to me.
For all the crops which were exchanged from the so-called New World back to the Old, most Americans would be shocked to find out that the domesticated apple went the opposite way. Because apples are as ubiquitous to the concept of autumn in North America as the actually native pumpkin, spectacularly changing leaves, and Halloween. Our first known apple orchard in the New World was planted from seed around 1625 in what would eventually become Boston Commons and Beacon Hill, but at the time was less than 20 years and about 600 miles removed from Jamestown, Virginia, the oldest permanent European settlement in the future 13 colonies. About a decade later, Boston orchards had already produced the first known American apple variety, the Roxbury Russet. This is especially unusual because apple trees are traditionally grafted from known varieties, making them essentially clones dating back decades or even centuries. The earliest written mention of grafting with credible sourcing is a medical trees from Greece from around 424 BCE. But even then, it was mentioned in the vein of a nigh universal familiarity, like Google it is now. And so estimates have the process arising somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. There are an insane number of grafting techniques, which literal millennia, huge swaths of people with different ideas and biodiversity. Duh. So I'll stick to the principles. This is a tree!
No kidding.
You want to take over?
Zip.
More importantly, a slice, about 3 years old, because the change of weather in a temperate environment affects the rate of growth from basically nothing in the fall and winter to a lot in the spring and summer.
Hence the rings.
Yeah, that growth is actually coming from this labor, the cambium. It's a very dense set of undifferentiated cells. Think stem cells in the bone marrow of a mammal. Typically, If they develop to the inside of the cambium, there'll be these thickly walled straws, called xylem, that passively allow water to be sucked up from the tree roots and provide the strength for trees to grow to massive heights. Cells that develop to the outside of the cambium are the phloem, and are responsible for shoving those nutrients made by the leaves during photosynthesis back down to the rest of the tree. As the cambium keeps pushing out newer and newer cells, the function of the old cells taper off and die. The straw-like xylem stay strong, but darken with leftover compounds which passively work to further strengthen and protect the tree against rot and disease. The sugar-pushing phloem fill up with air, first turning to a squishy cork before hardening into bark.
Cool, but
Why does this matter?
a little bit.
Well, when grafting, they have to cut through the bark layers on both the rootstock and the scion, so that the green cambium layers on each are directly touching. Then the whole thing gets bundled up with things like wax, moss, or grafting tape to support it and keep out excess moisture and bugs while the graft heals itself, using the pile of stem cells just chilling in the cambium. If the graft takes, each component will happily transfer resources to the other with no issues, but they will also share hormones and even exchange small genetic fragments. While the scion will produce fruit essentially cloned from the plant it was taken from, it will also benefit from the traits of its rootstock, like disease resistance, or even the size and frequency of its fruit. Rootstock selection is also how we get dwarf versions of otherwise normal 40-foot trees. And where an apple tree grown from seed will take about 10 years before it bears fruit, grafted trees will produce in about 3 years when using a mature scion.
Wow, then why didn't the colonists use grass?
Oh, they absolutely tried. The problem was, early settlers were predominantly English, and so were their apples. Domesticated apple trees have been growing in England since the Romans rolled in, and the settlers totally had little grafts and clippings of their favorite trees back home. But by that point, those trees were the end product of enduring like 1,200 years of natural selection specific to the climate, microbes, and soil composition of England. They simply struggled to tolerate such a different environment. And it's not just the obvious ones like rain and sunshine. For example, in the 1860s, there was an unknown disease absolutely ravaging vineyards throughout Europe. Like 2/3 of grapevines wiped out, vintners fleeing across oceans to start anew, the French government offering 300,000 francs to solve it.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
It was this microscopic pest called phylloxera, hitching rides on contaminated soil, plant cuttings, tools, even irrigation water. See, when grapevines from America had been imported by excitable horticulturalists, they had also accidentally brought phylloxera along. But where American vines had evolved resistances like a stickier sap to choke up the wee beasties, European vines had never encountered them. In order to save the wine industry, they had to import resistant American rootstock en masse, then graft them all by hand to the remaining European grapes. To this day, the wine industry is reliant nigh globally on the evolutionary arms race between these American rootstocks and the American pest trying to eat them. Roll the odometer back a few centuries, and for early colonists whose understanding of science stopped somewhere between the four humors and burning witches, a solution for the idea that an invisible pathogen could be lurking in otherwise normal-looking soil, sucking the life from this apple tree and that tree, but not the one between them, would be unfathomable. And even those grafted trees which managed to survive typically did not produce as many apples. The blossoms were there, but the bees weren't.
Not the bees!
Of the roughly 4,000 unique bee species native to North America, all of them fall into the category of buzz pollinators, meaning that they snatch onto a flower's sexy bits and vibrate their thorax until pollen poofs out. It's effective. Native plants don't need to bribe their pollinator with nectar, and the bee gets to skip making honey, or at least as we know it, in favor of these little pollen spitballs.
Wait, then there's no native honey in North America?
Nope. As a matter of fact, the last fossil record we have of a native North American honeybee is like 14 million years old, which means
14 million years that plants here evolved to not use them.
You win, Ollie.
honeybee pollination, on the other hand, is more passive on the bee's part. What honeybees are really after is the nectar found at the narrow base of the flower, with pollen just sort of falling on their clumsy badonkadonk as they rummage around for a better seat at the buffet. For plants, both pollen and nectar production are resource intensive, so specializing in attracting one kind of pollinator over another makes evolutionary sense. While bees of either method can successfully pollinate plants, they're less efficient and frankly, less interested. In the case of apples, A happy little bumblebee encountering the newfangled tree for the first time will be left wondering why the stingy SOB won't cough up more pollen for their buzztacular effort. In order to have a robust crop of apples, North American orchards rely on imported domesticated European honeybees, to the tune of like 1 hive for every acre of trees to be pollinated. But with grafts made from imported trees, which could survive the climate, and imported bees to pollinate them, colonial orchards took off. A 1644 survey from Maryland shows that 90% of their farms had orchards, because most farms really didn't do vast monoculture fields until industrialization and more efficient transportation was a thing. And if your brain immediately jumped to movies filled with enslaved peoples performing back-breaking labor beneath the sweltering sun to harvest cash crops like cotton and tobacco, you are not wrong. Plantations like that absolutely existed, but tobacco gets dried before it's shipped and sold. Cotton is fine as long as it's kept dry. Neither is particularly time-dependent like an apple or a tomato, and both require far more physical labor to cultivate than other crops. The sheer upfront capital to make that monstrosity function also made it rare. So statistically, in the very first US Census in 1790, when there were 697,681 slaves, there were roughly 4 million non-enslaved people, approximately 90% of the US population at the time, also working in agriculture. Even a well-to-do slave owner on a plantation like, say, George Washington's Mount Vernon, grew around 60 different crops, including most of the plantation's food. Like most farmers at the time, he practiced crop rotation for his commercial fields. First, the old Roman standard of 3 years before settling into a 7-year, 7-crop rotation. He also had between 600 and 1,000 sheep raised a year. He had about 300 head of cattle for dairy products. And he frequently exchanged grafts of his favorite orchard trees, apples, cherries, peaches, pawpaws, pears, with his friends, his neighbors, even his political acquaintances. And it's not on a, here's a sad potted plant as a housewarming gift scale. His diary upon receiving 215 apple trees is utterly blasé. He wrote more excitably about wheat varietals he wanted to experiment with. He loved fruit, he loved his orchards. It was just enough of a common occurrence to not be particularly remarkable. Washington is also a fantastic example of another colonial apple fixation.
Pie.
I mean, yes, but no. Do you want to talk about pie, bud?
Yes, please.
Colonists across the entire economic spectrum benefited from the inhumanity of sugar and molasses plantations throughout the Caribbean, because the trade winds sweeping up the eastern seaboard meant that a sailing ship could make a quick diversion to the port cities like Boston or Philly to offload raw sweetstuff and fill their holds with the colony's products like tobacco, cotton, and lumber. Meanwhile, colonial consumers would only be paying for sailors' labor of a week or two instead of the 6 to 8 weeks to England. That turned molasses and sugar from a fancy, sometimes food to a colonial pantry staple. Add butter from the ample space and availability of livestock, remove failing grains like barley, and all of a sudden, bam, you've got a sweet, flaky, delicious pie crust for the masses, meant to actually be eaten instead of a nasty, inedible food coffin that has characterized the average European's pies for centuries. That's why it's American as apple pie. We didn't invent it, we just made it actually delicious.
Apple pickle, mighty tasty. Apple butter, apple paste, apple dumpling.
How'd you like some apple sass?
Yes, ma'am.
Beyond eating, feeding livestock, and various preserves, early settlers loved to make cider with extra apples because it was so easy. You could crank press a bushel of apples, even mediocre assorted apples, whole, seeds, stems, skin, all of it, and leave a barrel to ferment for a few days to a few weeks, and end up with a drink that could be up to 5% alcohol per volume. Though significantly less common, a bit of extra time and distilling could knock that up to 33% for cider's big brother, Applejack, too. And quick note, a bunch of sources will state that cider existed because water was just so dangerous to drink. These sources are deeply silly. Humans have known how to build wells, boil water, or walk miles to flowing water for literal millennia. Early beer and whiskey didn't necessarily heat water involved high enough for long enough to reliably purify it. Cider and wine don't need to be heated at all, so there's no magically safe water there. And ethanol, the type of alcohol you can drink without, going blind or immediately dying, needs to be about 70% of the solution just to be mostly effective as a disinfectant. And even if the remaining 30% was only water, it wouldn't make up for how much water your body loses when it is expelling said booze. That's true regardless of the percentage because alcohol is a diuretic. The sheer fact that history is littered with cholera outbreaks and enemies deliberately spoiling each other's wells proves people drink water. Alcohol only pops up when a civilization has an excess of both food and boredom, not when they're dehydrating to death. But the rustic simplicity of making cider in the colonies also means that its production is hard to precisely quantify. First-hand sources from visitors claim that cider and orchards were everywhere, that it was passed around during lulls of the Revolutionary War battles. Future presidents like John Adams extolled its virtues, and we have receipts of George Washington buying it for votes in his first successful election, and 30 years later at a rager with some of his former troops. That cider is so far down those lists of libations can reasonably be chalked up to the whole "we have McDonald's at home" effect.
Is that a scientific term?
It is now. But this is the very real world that John Chapman, the future Johnny Appleseed, inhabited. He was born September 26, 1774, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, like half a year and 30 miles from the first shots of the Revolution in Lexington and Concord. His father was actually one of the Minutemen at Concord, among several early battles. The wartime spending, lack of regulation, lack of federal power and mint caused rampant inflation in the newly liberated colonies. Basically, the second half of Hamilton. Many of the former militia and regular soldiers, like John's father, found that the money that they had been paid in wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and their lands or businesses had kind of fallen apart, neglected for those 7 years of war, so they didn't exactly have goods to trade either. The fledgling government decided to solve this problem by offering new Western lands to veterans and settlers for basically free. And if it just happened to come at the expense of native tribes who had largely sided with the British only to be completely left out of the peace arrangement by their allies, well, no one in the new states was going to shed a tear. While these lands were fairly easy to claim, they all required some level of commitment to prove you were in it for the long haul instead of just a land speculator collecting it to flip it. Through the Ohio River Valley, a claim for 100 acres could be staked with the planting of just 50 apple trees and 20 peach trees within 3 years. Johnny Appleseed is imagined as tossing apple seeds around all willy-nilly as he wandered, but John Chapman was a nurseryman. He carefully planted seeds in fields he himself had cleared by hand, near where he anticipated settlers would be arriving, and then hemmed in those fields with brambly bushes to protect them as they grew. He also regularly returned to care for and eventually sell his juvenile apple trees. Well, in theory sell. In reality, he gave away about as many trees as he sold. He would barter for cast-off clothes, extend lines of credit, and then forget about the debt. And it makes sense. Money throughout his childhood was basically a lie. The seeds he was planting he picked up for free from yards of cider mills. The land was free, he never built a house, and he was willing to talk your ear off for however long you were willing to stuff his face with fruit and veg, but otherwise he foraged for his meals. Money wasn't really necessary. And when he did have some pocket change, he would do things like buy old or abused horses and just give them away to people after extracting a promise of better treatment for them. Just like earlier colonials, these new settlers had their favorite fruit trees, most of which were cultivated in the states by name and survived the push into western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. Rival nurserymen were set up selling these incredibly popular grafts in the same areas for 3 to 5 times what Chapman was theoretically charging for his. John could have done the same. He was apprenticed to a nurseryman. He knew how to graft, but he thought it hurt the trees. See, at some point, as like a 20-something, he got swept up in a Christian sect best known as the Swedenborgian Church. It hit at the right time to ride the wave of religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening.
Ah, so like the Mormons, Shakers, and Baptists.
Go on, Mr. 5 in A Push.
Well, the First Great Awakening was formally educated ministers in the 1730s, sermonizing brimstone and hellfire. Only without the music, because that was the devil too, along with women, happiness, and thinking for yourself.
Blessed be the fruit, baby.
The Second Great Awakening was circuit-riding ministers evangelizing to thousands of people, hallelujahing in the middle of random fields, focused less on studying rules as written and more on self-improvement and a personal connection to their God, which is why it's credited with spawning emancipation and temperance movements.
John Chapman's particular strain of religiosity was like Christianity with a flavor blast of Buddhism. All living things were to be treated with kindness and respect. So, cutting off a tree's otherwise healthy limb and peeling back the skin of another so you can force their cambiums to touch for your own personal pleasure sounds a little sick. Multiply it across tens of thousands, he didn't want to be tree Genghis Khan. Likewise, a lot of the crazy stories, like putting out his fire because he saw it kill a mosquito, or leaving the shelter of a log in the middle of winter so he didn't discomfort the bear already living there, while tall tales, aren't that far from a vegetarian pacifist who bought rescue horses and tore sections from his religious books so that the people he met could also improve. But that's just the first half of the story. We've got like another 150 years of America's apple obsession, but this video is already way too long, and we are not getting paid. So, if you're interested in part 2 on genetics, the red delicious, and what it means for you, or on a bigger picture look at some of our other American myths, like Paul Bunyan, make sure you share, like, sub, or drop a comment. Thanks for watching!